It is February 21, 2016, and today is the memorial of the defeat of Nicanor.
Yeah, if you're going by the Roman calendar, it would be February 22nd. But it's sunset here, so we're entering into Monday, and the 22nd is the memorial.
Right, and just to be clear, Roman calendar of where we presently are is the 21st, but going into the day of the Feast of Nicanor itself, according to the Roman calendar, it's the 22nd. So
yes.
Right now it is 8:12 Eastern Time on February 21st. So yes, going into this day, we're at the very beginning of it, started at sunset, and it will continue on until sunset tomorrow, at which time we will enter into the Feast of Purim. And that's all dealing with the history of the days of Esther and Mordecai. So we'll be dealing with that then. And actually this day does have a place in that history too, but since we'll be talking about it more tomorrow night and the next night, we won't go through it so much tonight. So this whole story of Nicanor, it takes place in the 2nd century BCE. We have a few writings that tell us of it, primarily 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees. There may have been others, but these are the primary sources that are preserved for us today. And we also have the accounts of Josephus, who, of course, his writing is a later account. 1st and 2nd Maccabees were written before Josephus was alive. But his account is important nonetheless because he had more resources available to him than we have available to us. So he had 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and it's evident in his writings that he used them as sources. But there were also other books of the Maccabees that he had and used as sources that we do not have. And just other writings in general, temple records and different things like that, which, fortunately for him, enabled him to have a broad knowledge on different points in Jewish history. And by having his writings, we can gain access to those things. So last year, on the memorial of the defeat of Nicanor, we read through 1st Maccabees. I'm not remembering if we read through any of 2nd Maccabees in relation to this.
As I recall, because I worked on editing the audios a couple of months ago, I think that we went through 1st Maccabees, only the section dealing, of course, with Nicanor, and we also went into 2nd Maccabees, and I think it's chapter 15, which also deals with this. So we touched on both, as I recall.
Good, excellent. So yes, in that case, I think it'll be best for us to look at the history of Josephus, or the history that Josephus records for us, which I'll mention where it is so that you guys can maybe pull it up, and then we'll ask our Heavenly Family to guide us in relation to this. So the place where this is in Josephus, it is in Antiquities, otherwise known as Antiquities of the Jews or Jewish Antiquities, Book 12, Chapter 10. And of course, this can be found on the Early Jewish Writings website. So earlyjewishwritings.com, and then there's a section at the bottom on Josephus, and he has the whole series, 20 volumes of Antiquities, and then you can click Book 12 and then go down to Chapter 10. All right, so let us now ask our Heavenly Family for blessings in looking at this. Father and mother and brother and sister, thank you so much for the opportunity for us to come together again. And thank you for bringing it about for us to have more regular meetings. We really do need the constant focus on your truth and on the history of your people and on the principles that you have for us to learn. So, Heavenly Family, I don't know all the significance of this history that we're going to be looking at. And I don't know what all you intend to teach us through it tonight. But we come before you ready to learn. Please do show us. Sister, please bring this about to be the best meeting that possibly can be. Help us to gain a true understanding of any and everything that you want to teach us tonight. And bind us together in love, that we may represent your character to the world, and that your kingdom may be fully established, and we can all rest in peace. Thank you, Heavenly Family. So we ask these things in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so I will also mention, as Teresa just said, she had recently edited our study from last year that we had going through First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, specifically the portions relevant for the defeat of Nicanor. And so if anyone wants to go through that and kind of hear our discussion, that's on the YouTube channel. And I think Teresa recently posted it on Facebook.
No, last night, I think.
Okay, excellent. And the passages in 1st and 2nd Maccabees are 1st Maccabees chapter 7 and 2nd Maccabees chapter 15 for anyone who wants to just go and read it afterward. So, going back to Josephus now, we have Antiquities, Book 12, Chapter 10. The title is How Bacchides, the general of Demetrius' army, made an expedition against Judea and returned without success, and how Nicanor was sent a little afterward against Judas and perished together with his army, as also concerning the death of Alcimus and the succession of Judas. Okay, so right there in the title, it kind of lets you know the general time. So we have Judas here, which is Judas Maccabeus, which lets us know that we're in the time of the Maccabees, and this is at a point when Judas is actually already having a structured army and has done a number of the things which made him famous. This is after the beginning of the Maccabean revolt, and so now they are a force to be reckoned with. But of course, according to the Greeks, they're still very, very small in number. I will mention at the beginning of 1st Maccabees chapter 7, when it starts the story, it says, in the 151st year, Demetrius, son of Seleucus, set out from Rome, etc., etc. The 151st year, according to the note in the New Revised Standard Version Apocrypha, it was 161 BC. So that's the general time that historians would give to this. And so this starting point is the same starting point in Josephus, although we don't necessarily get a date from what we read in Josephus. So I wanted to mention that. So, okay, we're at about 161 BC, and that's where this starts. So would anyone like to start reading from the beginning of chapter 10 of Antiquities, Book 12?
All right, so chapter 10, paragraph 1. About the same time, Demetrius, the son of Seleucus, fled away from Rome and took Tripoli, a city in Syria, and set the diadem on his own head. He also gathered certain mercenary soldiers together and entered into his kingdom, and was joyfully received by all who delivered themselves up to him. And when they had taken Antiochus the king and Lysias, they brought them to him alive, both which were immediately put to death by the command of Demetrius. When Antiochus had reigned 2 years, as we have already elsewhere related, but there were now many of the wicked Jewish renegades that came together to him, and with Alcimus the high priest, who accused the whole nation, and particularly Judas and his brethren, and said that they had slain all his friends. And those in his kingdom that were of his party and waited for his return were by them put to death, that these men had ejected them out of their own country and caused them to be sojourners in a foreign land. And they desired that he would send one of his own friends, and know from him what mischief Judas' party had done.
Okay. So I think it'll be helpful for us each paragraph to kind of recap it, discuss it, make sure we're all following, especially since, when we're reading history that we are not as familiar with, it's easy to, kind of be lost in, okay, so who are these people? What are these names? What is this even talking about?
Oh, yeah, even with the amount that we've read in the past, I'm still lost at the moment. We'll get there, but...
Yeah, hey, this is all new to me and new to everyone here, I'm sure. So Demetrius, son of Seleucus, to my knowledge, he was the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, or that portion of the divided Greek Empire at this time. And so from the beginning, he goes to Rome, he takes Tripoli, and when it says he sets the diadem on his own head, it's basically saying that he took rulership. After that, we have this whole circumstance with Antiochus and Lysias, and I'm not sure which Antiochus it is here. There were at least 4 or 5 Antiochuses. In fact, there were a number of Demetriuses as well. And so they come and they are both put to death. And then we have Alcimus, who is the high priest of the Jewish nation, and he comes and accuses the whole nation, as it says here, and particularly Judas and his brothers, of slaying his friends, and also that he also accused them, let's see, it says that those in his kingdom that were of his party and waited for his return were by them put to death. So basically all of his friends and allies of Alcimus, the high priest, were basically put to death by Judas Maccabeus and his brothers. That's the accusation. And of course the way that it's being written here implies that Josephus understood that to not be the case, and that Alcimus was falsely bringing charges upon them. So then again, I'll read this last portion again. And they desire that he would send someone of his own friends and know from him what mischief Judas's part had done.
Party.
Oh, that's interesting. Mine it says part. Perhaps
Mine
it's
says
a typo.
party.
Could very well be a typo.
Yeah, I think it would. Seems like it would be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so is everyone kind of following the basic plot so far?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so if you wanted to continue, Ed, that's fine, or if someone else wanted to read.
Someone else want to? Okay. At this, Demetrius was very angry and sent Bacchides, a friend of Antiochus Epiphanes, a good man and one that had been instructed with all Mesopotamia, and gave him an army, and committed Alcimus, the high priest, to his care, and gave him charge to slay Judas and those that were with him. So Bacchides made haste and went out of Antioch with his army, and when he was come into Judea, he sent to Judas and his brethren to discourse with them about a league of friendship and peace, for he had a mind to take him by treachery. But Judas did not give credit to him, for he saw that he came with so great an army as men do not bring when they come to make peace, but to make war. However, some of the people acquiesced in what Bacchides caused to be proclaimed, and supposing they should undergo no considerable harm from Alcimus, who was their countryman, they went over to them, and when they had received oaths from both of them that neither they themselves nor those of the same sentiments should come to any harm, they instructed themselves with them. But Bacchides troubled himself about the oaths he had taken, but slew 70 of them, although by not keeping his faith with those that first went over, he deterred all the rest who had intentions to go over to him from doing it. But as he was gone out of Jerusalem, and was the village called Bethesda, he sent out and caught many of the deserters, and some of the people also, and slew them all, and enjoined all that lived in the country to submit to Alcimus. So he left him there with some part of the army, that he might wherewith to keep the country in obedience, and returned to Antioch to King Demetrius.
Okay. There was a footnote also at the beginning of the paragraph, or close to the beginning. I'll read the first part again up to the footnote and then read the footnote. At this, Demetrius was very angry and sent Bacchides, a friend of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, at least in the version that I have right there, it has a footnote. Mm-hmm. It says, "It is no way probable that Josephus would call Bacchides, that bitter and bloody enemy of the Jews, as our present copies have it, a man good or kind or gentle. What the author of the first book of Maccabees, whom Josephus here follows, instead of that character says of him, is that he was a great man in the kingdom, and faithful to his king," which was very probably Josephus's meaning also. Okay, because it says here, at this, Demetrius was very angry and sent Bacchides, a friend of Antiochus Epiphanes, a good man. So it's probably not the case that he's referring to him as a morally good man, but that he was a great man in the kingdom. So would anyone like to kind of summarize the contents of that paragraph?
Sounds like politics today.
Yeah, some things don't change.
Well, I would just have to go through it from the beginning again, real slow, and thinking about it. So, okay, so at this, after the first, what we read in the first paragraph there, the accusations and all that, and of Judas's party killing, who was it specifically that they were supposed to have killed?
The friends and allies of Alcimus, the Jewish high priest. Okay.
So at this, Demetrius was angry, So Demetrius sends Bacchides, who is a friend of Antiochus Epiphanes, and Bacchides has been entrusted with all of Mesopotamia. So he's in charge of Mesopotamia, and Bacchides is given an army, and Alcimus, the high priest, is given or committed to his care. So Alcimus is committed to the care of Bacchides. And Bacchides is given permission to kill Judas, or to slay Judas, and everyone that's with Judas. Mm-hmm. Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention, here it mentions that Bacchides was a friend of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes, again, he's the one who is kind of one of the most famous opponents of the Jews. He is the king in 4th Maccabees, who was bringing all these tortures on the Jews. He's the one who defiled the temple, and, he's the one who brought a pig and slayed it on the altar, or slaughtered it on the altar, different things like that. So this guy, being a friend of Antiochus, is already kind of painting the picture of what he's...
Pretty wicked.
Yeah, what he's supposed to be like.
Okay. So then Bacchides hurries and leaves. He went out, leaves Antioch with the army. And then when he gets to Judea, he sends a message to Judas and his brethren. He wants to talk with them to have a league of friendship and peace. But he's really planning to trick them. Mm-hmm. And Judas doesn't believe him. He sees that his intentions can't be good because he has such a huge amount of people there. It's obviously an army come to make war. But not everybody saw that and believed that, and they gave in to what Bacchides suggested, and they didn't think they'd have any harm from Alcimus, who was their countryman. So Alcimus, whatever, the high priest, they figured, well, he's with Bacchides, so we're safe. So they went on over to talk.
So in other words, they weren't expecting that Alcimus or Bacchides would really be that great of a threat to them. They weren't expecting them to be having any sort of wicked plot.
Right. So they receive oaths from both Alcimus and Bacchides that neither themselves. Now let me see. When it says, okay, they went over to them, and when they had received oaths from both of them is, I was understanding that to be Alcimus and Bacchides. Yeah?
And that seems to be the case.
Okay. So when they had received oaths from Bacchides and Alcimus that neither they themselves nor those of the same sentiments should come to any harm, they entrusted themselves with them.
So they themselves there is referring to those who received oaths from Alcimus and Bacchides. So they were swearing, we will not bring any harm to you or those with you.
Yeah. But Bacchides troubled not himself about the oaths he had taken. So in other words, it didn't mean anything to him. They were just words. And he went ahead and killed 60 of them, 70 of them, although by not keeping his faith with those that first went over, he deterred all the rest. So once they saw the rest of them who hadn't gone over, saw that those who had gone over got killed, then, the game was up. Who had intentions to go over to him from doing it. So they were considering going, but they were like, oh, no, he's not playing fair at all. He's totally up to no good. But as he was gone out of Jerusalem and was at the village called Beth-Zepho, he sent out and caught many of the deserters, and some of the people also, and slew them all. So is that deserters from his own army? Sounds like.
It doesn't seem to be the case necessarily because, people were coming over to him, but they were deterred.
Okay, so deserters as in deserting from Judas and his party, and they were maybe considering going over to Alcimus and Bacchides, but then they're like, no, but they just desert altogether. But Bacchides still gets them and kills them. Okay, and enjoined all that lived in the country to submit to Alcimus. So he left him there with some part of the army. So Bacchides leaves Alcimus there with part of the army, that he might have wherewith to keep the country in obedience. So, police state, basically. And then Bacchides returned to Antioch to King Demetrius.
Okay. Yeah, that helped me to get the flow of everything.
Oh, me too. You got to read it 2 or 3 times.
Okay. Shall we go on to paragraph 3? Or are there any other comments or questions?
I just want to say that I really appreciate Teresa going really slow with that because it is confusing to us. First off, the names are difficult for my brain to comprehend because it's such a different language for me. And so it's hard for me to put like a face with this name and a face with that name and try to figure out who's doing what. So I really appreciate you going slow enough for us to really catch that. Thanks, Teresa.
Oh, well, that's great. But it just so happens that's how slow I had to go for me to get it, too. So I'm glad it worked.
Well, yeah, it is. This is the type of thing that, especially just not being used to this, yeah, it can take a while to grasp the history, the flow of things, what's really happening. I mean, Josephus is talking about this like, oh, and then Demetrius, and then him, and everyone probably knew what he was talking about because this was more recent history to them than it was important history, but we're a couple thousand years removed from it now. So,
getting harder to understand.
Certainly.
Should I go on?
I suppose so.
Sure.
Okay, so paragraph 3. But Alcimus was desirous to have the dominion more firmly assured to him, and understanding that, if he could bring it about that the multitude should be his friends, he should govern with greater security. He spake kind words to them all, and discoursed to each of them after an agreeable and pleasant manner, by which means he quickly had a great body of men and an army about him. Although the greater part of them were of the wicked and the deserters. With these, whom he, as his servants and soldiers, went all over the country and slew all that he could find of Judas's party. But when Judas saw that Alcimus was already become great and had destroyed many of the good and holy men of the country, he also went all over the country and destroyed those that were of the other party. But when Alcimus saw that he was not able to oppose Judas, nor was equal to him in strength, he resolved to apply himself to King Demetrius for his assistance. So he came to Antioch and irritated him against Judas and accused him, alleging that he had undergone a great many miseries by his means, and that he would do more mischief unless he were prevented and brought punishment, which must be done by sending a powerful force against him.
Well, that was an easier paragraph to understand even the first time through, but still, I didn't get all of it.
Yeah, I think it'll be good to go back over it again and to just recap, do the same sort of thing that we've
totally
been doing? Yeah. Okay, so does anyone want to do that?
I'm happy to do it again, I suppose.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, so after that, what we just read in paragraph 2, and I just happened to notice, I just went back to the conference screen. We have a couple people on who haven't been on for very long. So I'll just tell them where we're at. So what we're doing is tonight enters into the day, the 13th day of Adar, which is the 12th Hebrew month. And on the 13th day of Adar, there is the memorial of the defeat of Nicanor. And this was something that took place in the days of the Maccabees. And what we're actually doing the last couple of years, we've gone through this, going through the books of the Maccabees. And this year what we're doing is we're actually reading what Josephus has to say about this history. We've never gone through it before. So we are in the book Antiquities by Josephus, and that can be found on earlyjewishwritings.com. And then you just go down until you see Josephus's name, and then click on Antiquities and then book 12. And we're in chapter 10, and each chapter has numbered paragraphs. And we just read paragraph 3, and we're about to go through that again, just to kind of recap it. So Bacchides had taken Alcimus, the Jewish high priest. They basically took over this town, the city, and Bacchides left Alcimus there to reign or to rule or whatever. Okay.
And he left part of his army there with him.
Right. Yes, thank you. So then paragraph 3 says, but Alcimus was desirous to have the dominion more firmly assured to him. So he's wanting to, he doesn't want his rule to be so precarious. And he figures out that he'll have more of a following if he can be their friends, basically, or can kind of get them to think of him as their friends. And so he says, Josephus writes, that Alcimus, understanding that if he could bring it about that the multitude should be his friends, that he should govern with greater security. So Alcimus was speaking kind words to all of them, and was, speaking in an agreeable and pleasant manner. So by this means, he quickly gained a following. But the majority of his following weren't those who were faithful and had allegiance basically to Judas Maccabeus. They were those who had deserted the party of Judas Maccabeus and would have taken sides with Bacchides had they not seen that the first group of people who deserted the Judas party got killed. So these were deserters and not faithful to Judas.
And I just want to add to that, so he's basically winning people over to loyalty to him. And so it says here that he is basically quickly getting himself a great body of men, so supporters and an army about him. So he's increasing his supporters and he's increasing his army.
Right. That's a good point. Okay.
And the deserters, I'd have to go back to see how this is spoken of, because I think it talks about deserters in the books of Maccabees as well. And it might be more specifically in reference to deserters of the covenant. So that's something for us to check out, and perhaps someone here remembers from past studies.
Okay. I don't remember. Do you want me to go on?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
That sounds good.
So, with all these that he's kind of gained as friends, and they've given their allegiance to him, basically, with these whom he used as his servants and soldiers, he went all over the country and slew all that he could find of Judas's party. So, yeah, they're definitely not faithful to Judas Maccabeus. They had left his farm, and now they're fighting against him, along with Alcimus. But when Judas saw that Alcimus was already become great and had destroyed many of the good and holy men of the country, so Judas is seeing what Alcimus is doing. He's killing a lot of good and great men. Judas also goes all over the country and destroys those that were of the other party. Is that how you're understanding that?
I was looking at something else here. Could you repeat that?
Sure. So I'll just read it as it is. But when Judas saw that Alcimus was already become great and had destroyed many of the good and holy men of the country, I'm reading that as Judas, yeah. He also went all over the country and destroyed those that were of the other party.
Yeah.
So, yes.
The party of Alcimus.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back. I looked in 1 Maccabees chapter 7, verse 19, and it says, Then Bacchides withdrew from Jerusalem and encamped in Beth Zaith, which is the place that it referred to earlier. And he sent and seized many of the men who had deserted to him, and some of the people, and killed them and threw them into a great pit.
So they had deserted from Judas to Bacchides.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. Deserted from Judas or from the Jewish nation in general, whether they had particular loyalties. But, hey, Judas was basically leading the Jewish nation at that time, or at least a significant portion of it. Obviously, people like Alcimus were not in favor of Judas. So, yeah, that I think helps to confirm.
It does confirm.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Let's see here. Okay, so now Judas counteracts or whatever. He counterattacks. But when Alcimus saw that he was not able to oppose Judas, nor was equal to him in strength, he resolved to apply himself to King Demetrius for his assistance. So Alcimus sees, okay, he's not going to be able to beat Judas. He can't overcome him, so he asks King Demetrius for assistance. So Alcimus goes to Antioch and gets King Demetrius all upset with Judas. He irritated him against Judas and accused him, alleging, so Alcimus is accusing Judas and alleging that Judas had undergone a great many, so many he's and hims. So Alcimus accuses Judas to King Demetrius, gets Demetrius upset with Judas, and says that he, Alcimus, had undergone a great many miseries because of Judas, and that Judas would do more mischief unless he were prevented and brought to punishment, and that his suggestion was that this must be done by sending a powerful force against Judas. So Alcimus wants King Demetrius to give more men, a bigger army to go and destroy Judas and his party.
And this is where Nicanor comes in.
Okay.
All right, so any other comments or questions on this, or does someone want to read the next paragraph?
I can keep going.
Okay, excellent.
Cool.
So Demetrius, being already of opinion that it would be a thing pernicious to his own affairs to overlook Judas, now he was overcoming so great, sent against him Nicanor, the most kind and most faithful of all of his friends. For he it was who fled away with him from the city of Rome. He also gave him as many forces as he thought sufficient for him to conquer Judas withal, and bid him not to spare the nation at all. When Nicanor was come to Jerusalem, he did not resolve to fight Judas immediately, but judged it better to get him into his power by treachery. So he sent him a message of peace, and he said there was no manner of necessity for them to fight and hazard themselves, and that he would give him his oath that he would do him no harm, for that he only came with some friends in order to let him know what King Demetrius' intentions were and what opinion he had of their nation. When Nicanor had delivered this message, Judas and his brethren compiled with him, and suspecting no deceit, they gave him assurances of friendship and received Nicanor with his army. But while he was saluting Judas and they were talking together, he gave a certain signal to his own soldiers, upon which they were to seize upon Judas. But he perceived the treachery and ran back to his own soldiers and fled away with them. So upon this discovery of his purpose and the snares laid for Judas, Nicanor determined to make open war with him and gathered his army together and prepared for fighting him. And upon joining battle with him at a certain village called Carphalsoma, he beat Judas and forced him to fly to that citadel which was at Jerusalem.
Okay. Again, that's
a lot there to keep straight.
Yeah, a lot there to keep straight, and some treachery, that's for sure.
No kidding.
Yeah. All right, so we want to go back to the beginning of the paragraph again?
Yeah, does anyone else want to take a stab at it this time? Or do you prefer me to do it?
You're doing so well. You're doing great.
Okay. Well, I'm totally happy to do it because for me, my learning style, this actually works best for me to just go through it myself anyway. So, hey, if it also works good for you guys, it's a win-win. That's awesome.
Excellent.
Okay, so Alcimus had just asked for more men to go destroy Judas. So Demetrius, King Demetrius, already thought that it would be a really bad thing to overlook Judas, to not take him seriously. So he recognized that Judas was becoming really great. He's like, no, this isn't good. So Demetrius sends Nicanor to go destroy Judas and Judas's followers. And Nicanor is the most faithful of all the king's friends. Demetrius and Nicanor had fled away from the city of Rome together. Now, I don't know the story about that, but they go back a ways, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's what was referred to at the beginning of paragraph 1 when it said that, let's see here. It says, about the same time, Demetrius, son of Seleucus, fled away from Rome and took Tripoli, a city of Syria, and set the diadem on his own head. So basically, they both fled Rome together at the time when Demetrius was about to take up his rule.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay. So he sends Nicanor. King Demetrius also gave Nicanor as many forces as he thought sufficient for him to conquer Judas, and asked Nicanor not to even spare the nation, just to kill everybody. So Nicanor went to Jerusalem, and he decided he wasn't going to try to openly fight Judas right away. He thought it would be better to get him into his power by treachery. So he's going to take the road of deceit. So he sends a message of peace to Judas, and he's like, hey, there's no need for us to fight and risk hurting ourselves. And he says he would give him his oath that he would do Judas no harm. And he only came with some friends in order to let him know what King Demetrius' intentions were and what opinion he had of their nation. So in other words, yeah, King Demetrius, he's not happy about this, or whatever, but hey, it's no big deal. We can work this out. So Nicanor delivered the message, and Judas and his brethren complied, and they didn't suspect deceit. Interesting that earlier, when it was Bacchides and Alcimus, they did suspect deceit.
Right, so it makes it look like if these forces that Nicanor had with him actually came with him, they were still...
It was a smaller number.
Or at least they were hidden away enough that they were not easily perceived. And so, hey, just one guy and a few friends. And, of course, they could be thinking that, okay, well, last time they came and it didn't work out, and we basically... it hasn't worked out to their advantage because Alcimus is trying to take over the nation, but we're taking him over in return. So maybe because, we are a great force, maybe they do just want to make peace with us.
Right. Okay. So Judas and his brethren didn't suspect any deceit, and they gave him assurances of friendship, and they received Nicanor and his army. But while Nicanor was saluting Judas and they were talking together, he gave a certain signal to his soldiers. So there was some private signal, secret signal, and Nicanor gives it, and that was a signal that the army is supposed to seize Judas. But Judas picks up on this, and he manages to escape, runs back to his own soldiers, and they flee away. So upon this discovery of his purpose and of the snares laid for Judas, so upon the discovery of his purpose, and the snares laid for Judas, Nicanor decides to make open war with him. So treachery, deceit, that didn't work. Well, it's open war now. So he gathers together his army and prepares to fight with Judas and his army. And upon joining battle with him at a certain village called Kafar Salama, he actually beats Judas and forces him to fly to his citadel, which is at Jerusalem. So there's another word for that. What is that?
Citadel? Another word for citadel? Let's see if I can find.
When a king has a hideaway,
a fortress,
stronghold is actually the word I was looking for. Stronghold or fortress, yeah.
And actually, at this point, there's a footnote which says Josephus's copies must have been corrupted when they here give victory to Nicanor, contrary to the words following, which imply that he who was beaten fled into the citadel, which for certain belonged to the city of David or to Mount Zion, and was in the possession of Nicanor's garrison, and not of Judah's. As also it is contrary to the express words of Josephus' original author, 1 Maccabees 7:32, who says that Nicanor lost about 500 men and fled to the city of David.
Interesting.
So I'm going to go back to that. Okay.
Well, in fact, the very first part of the next paragraph. And when Nicanor came down from the citadel unto the temple, so in paragraph 5, it looks like Nicanor was the one that fled to the citadel.
Okay.
And historically speaking, that citadel was under the control of Nicanor, not Judas. So
at
Judas
this point, that does seem to be the case. I'll read the section here from 1 Maccabees 7, verses 29 to 32. So he came to Judas, he being Nicanor, and they greeted one another peaceably, but the enemy were preparing to kidnap Judas. It became known to Judas that Nicanor had come to him with treacherous intent, and he was afraid of him and would not meet him again. When Nicanor learned that his plan had been disclosed, he went out to meet Judas in battle near Kfar Salamah. About 500 of the army of Nicanor fell, and the rest fled into the city of David. So very clear from 1 Maccabees that it was actually
Nicanor who fled.
So
interesting.
That's an important footnote.
Yeah, no kidding. It pays to read the footnotes.
Absolutely. Good mental note for everyone. Let's always make sure to read footnotes. Okay, so
any other comments by anyone?
Yeah.
Yes, I have a comment. Okay, so we're reading from Josephus's history, correct?
Yes.
And his history is giving us a little conflict of other things that have been written, and I'm wondering, how could he have given us such a conflict there?
Right. That's an excellent question. The way it puts it in the footnote is that it says Josephus's copies must have been corrupted when they here give victory to Nicanor. So the way it seems as though the person who translated Josephus here, the way that they understand it is that whatever the copies were of First Maccabees, most likely, that Josephus had, they probably had corrupted readings that make it look the other way around. So Josephus, in following his source, in that section, probably had it like that. But then even within Josephus, it's conflicting because the next paragraph isn't assuming that Judas and his army are in the citadel. It's assuming that Nicanor and his army had gone to the citadel. Because it says, and when Nicanor came down from the citadel into the temple, etc., etc. So it's either that whatever Josephus was working from had been corrupted. And again, corrupted doesn't necessarily mean that someone changed it with malicious intent. It could just mean that someone miscopied something. The other possibility is that the copies of Josephus's writings themselves are corrupted. So it's basically that perhaps Josephus did not actually write that Judas fled to the citadel, but he actually wrote that it was Nicanor, but that somewhere in the transmission of the Antiquities that Josephus wrote, a scribe copied something down incorrectly, and we end up with it the way it is.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Shall we continue on to paragraph 5?
Okay, so paragraph 5. And when Nicanor came down from the citadel unto the temple, some of the priests and elders met him, and saluted him, and showed him the sacrifices which they offered up to God for the king, upon which he blasphemed, and threatened them, that unless the people would deliver up Judas to him, upon his return, he would pull clown. I'm sure that's supposed to be down their temple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pull down their temple. And when he had thus threatened them, he departed from Jerusalem. But the priests fell into tears out of grief at what he had said, and besought God to deliver them from their enemies. But now for Nicanor, when he was gone out of Jerusalem and was at a certain village called Betharon, he there pitched his camp, another army out of Syria having joined him. And Judas pitched his camp at Adasa, another village, which was 30 furlongs distance from Betharon, having more than 1,000 soldiers. And when he had encouraged them not to be dismayed at the multitude of their enemies, nor to regard how many they were against, whom they were going to fight, but to consider who they themselves were, and for what great reward they had hazarded themselves, and to attack the enemy courageously, he led them out to fight, and joining battle with Nicanor, which proved to be a severe one, he overcame the enemy and slew many of them. And at last Nicanor himself, as he was fighting gloriously, fell, upon whose fall the army did not stay. But when they had lost their general, they were put to flight and threw down their arms. Judas also pursued them and slew them, and gave notice by the sound of the trumpets to the neighboring villages that he had conquered the enemy, which when the inhabitants heard, they put on their armor hastily and met their enemies in the face as they were running away, and slew them, inasmuch that not one of them escaped out of this battle, who were in number 9,000. This victory happened to fall on the 30th day of that month, which the Jews called Adar, and by the Macedonians Dystrus, and the Jews thereon celebrate this victory every year, and esteem it as a festival day, after which the Jewish nation were for a while free from wars and enjoyed peace, but afterward they returned to their former state of wars and hazards.
Okay, so this is getting to the actual event, which is memorialized this day. So let's go over that paragraph again from the beginning.
All right. So we determined that it was Nicanor who must have fled to the citadel. So Nicanor, when he comes down from the citadel unto the temple, some of the priests and elders met him and saluted him. And they showed Nicanor the sacrifices which they offered to God for the king. So they're trying to be peaceable about it. They're like, look, we don't hate the king. Mm-hmm. We're offering sacrifices to God on behalf of the king.
Yeah.
But Nicanor just blasphemes and threatens them and says that unless the people would deliver up Judas to him, when he comes back, he'll destroy their temple. And after threatening them like this, he leaves from Jerusalem. Then the priests are in tears. They're grieving over what he said, and they're asking God to deliver them from their enemies. But Nicanor, when he had left Jerusalem and was at a village called Betharon, he pitched camp there, and another army from Syria has joined him at this point. And Judas, meanwhile, pitches camp at Adasa, another village, and that village is 30 furlongs distant from Betharon. And Judas has no more than 1,000 soldiers. So I don't know how much 30 furlongs is, but I think you're going to find out.
It's about 3.75 miles.
Okay. So that's the distance between their two camps. Let's see, where's my spot at? Okay. So Judas has no more than 1,000 soldiers. And when he had encouraged them not to be dismayed at the multitude of their enemies, nor to regard how many they were against whom they were going to fight. In other words, hey, don't be discouraged by how many they are and how few you are, but to consider who they themselves were and for what great rewards they hazarded themselves. So remember who you are, you're God's people, or whatever it was that he was pointing them to specifically to remember. Remember who you are, and remember why we're here, why we are risking our lives, and attack the enemy courageously. So he gives them that pep talk, whatever, motivational talk, and then he leads them out to battle. And they joined battle with Nicanor, and it was a severe one. But he overcame the enemy and slew many of them. And finally, Nicanor himself falls. He's wounded mortally. He dies. Now, when this happens, his army doesn't stick around. As soon as Nicanor falls, the army flees. When they had lost their general, they were put to flight, and they threw down their arms. So they threw down their weapons. Judas also pursued them and slew them, and gave notice by the sound of the trumpets to the neighboring villages that he had conquered the enemy. So Judas doesn't let the army of Nicanor just run away. He chases them down and kills them, and then sounds a trumpet as a signal to the neighboring villages that Nicanor's army is defeated. So when the inhabitants of these other villages nearby heard the trumpet, they put on their armor hastily and met their enemies in the face as they were running away and slew them. So Judas wasn't able to catch all of the fleeing people in the army of Nicanor. And so the trumpet is more of a signal that, hey, they're fleeing your way, get ready.
Yeah.
So they get ready, and they kill the people as they come their way. So they slew them insomuch that not one of them escaped out of this battle. Wow. And there was 9,000 of them in Nicanor's army, and they all got killed, according to this. So this victory happened to fall on the 13th day of that month, which by the Jews is called Adar, or Adar, and by the Macedonians, Distrus. So the month is called Distrus by the Macedonians, and it's called Adar by the Jews. And the Jews thereon celebrate this victory every year and esteem it as a festival day, after which the Jewish nation were, for a while, free from wars and enjoyed peace. But afterward, they returned into their former state of wars and hazards.
Yeah, that's interesting. In 1 Maccabees, the way it puts it is, so the land of Judah had rest for a few days.
Yeah.
And it goes on into other things. There's interesting things in the account in 1 Maccabees. When it talks about the priests hearing what Nicanor said, it says what they said. The priests wept and said, "You chose this house to be called by your name and to be for your people a house of prayer and supplication. Take vengeance on this man and on his army, and let them fall by the sword. Remember their blasphemies and let them live no longer." So that's what it records the priests saying. And then with Judas, when it came to kind of what he said to rouse his army to courage, in 1 Maccabees, it basically just says that he prayed and said, when the messengers from the king spoke blasphemy, your angel went out and struck down 185,000 of the Assyrians. So also crush this army before us today. Let the rest learn that Nicanor has spoken wickedly against the sanctuary, and judge him according to this wickedness. So that's the account there in 1 Maccabees of what he said. 2 Maccabees also has a very, very similar account. So here, Josephus more or less summarizes that.
Could I make a quick comment?
Sure.
Well, I noticed earlier in that last paragraph that was read something that I thought was kind of interesting. You know, when the trumpet told this other town all about it, it made me think to myself, okay, I don't think I could blow a trumpet to tell anybody anything. They must have had something like their own form of Morse code or something to be able to tell them, hey, this has happened and they're coming your way. They must have had a method that everyone had memorized and learned, like Indians, you know, they did smoke signals. So did anybody else notice that? I mean, you can't
Yeah, I noticed it. It made me think of Numbers 10, where when the children of Israel were in the desert, and they had these thousands and thousands of people, and whenever the Shekinah would get up and move, the silver trumpets had to be blown in a certain way. And for everything that they did, they had to blow the trumpets a certain way.
Yeah, there was different trumpet blasts and all of that.
So this is just something that's a part of the history of the Jews, is that they signal at long distances with trumpets with certain sounds.
And possibly, short and longs and stuff like that. Anyway, I just thought that was really interesting because it seems like mankind has always devised some way of communicating at a distance.
Yeah.
Certainly.
All through history, all military always used the trumpet. They had calls for attacks, for retreat, for watching their left flank, their right flank. There was major strategic issues that they all had to deal with, and so they've all through history, they've always had something, reattack, reassemble yourself, do a counterattack, and all those things are all by trumpet. So it's common not just with the Jews, but you see it in the Civil Wars and the Napoleon Wars and the British. Every one of them has always had a series of, and you could basically sort of guess at every single one of them. Basically, all the action that you would need as a commander, there was a signal for it that was basically consistent. Even the enemy knew those sounds, and they would blow their trumpets according to hearing what the other trumpet was blowing, so they could tell their people what to do as well too. So it was common in all military armies. I'm not sure.
Definitely. Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah. Any other comments, questions on this paragraph? I think we only have one more to go.
Yep. All right, Ed. It's all yours again.
All right, paragraph 6. But now, as the priest Alchemist was resolving to pull down the wall of the sanctuary, which had been there of old time, and had been built by the holy prophets, he was smitten suddenly by God and fell down. This stroke made him fall speechless upon the ground, and undergoing torments for many days, he at length died, when he had been high priest for 4 years. And when he was dead, the people bestowed the high priesthood of Judas, who, hearing of the power of the Romans, and that they had conquered in war Galatia and Liberia and Carthage and Libya, and that besides these they had subdued Greece and their kings, Perseus and Philip, and Antiochus the Great also, he resolved to enter into the league of friendship with them. He therefore sent to Rome some of his friends, Eupolemus, the son of John, and Jason, the son of Eleazar, and by them desired the Romans that they would assist them and be their friends, and would write to Demetrius that he would not fight against the Jews. So the Senate received the ambassadors that came from Judas to Rome, and discoursed with them about the errand on which they came, and then granted them a league of assistance. They also made a decree concerning it, and sent a copy of it to Judea. It was also laid up in the Capitol and engraven in brass. The decree itself was this: the decree of the Senate concerning a league of assistance and friendship with the nation of the Jews. It shall not be lawful for any that are subject to the Romans to make war with the nation of the Jews, nor to assist those that do, either by sending them corn or ships or money, and if they attack be made upon the Jews, the Romans shall assist them as far as they are able, and again, if any attack be made upon Romans, the Jews shall assist them. And if the Jews have a mind to add to or take away anything from this league of assistance, that shall be done with the common consent of the Romans, and whatsoever addition shall be thus made, it shall be of force. This decree was written by Eupolemus, the son of John, and by Jason, the son of Eleazar, when Judas was high priest of the nation, and Simon his brother was general of the army. And this was the first league that the Romans made with the Jews, and was managed after this manner.
Okay.
Some interesting stuff in this one, although a lot of it was just way over my head the first time.
All right, well, let's go back to the beginning.
All right. Okay. So Nicanor's been defeated. He died. His whole army is wiped out now, and there's a little bit of peace. But now, as the high priest Alcimus was resolving to pull down the wall of the sanctuary, which had been there of old time, and had been built by the holy prophets, he was smitten suddenly by God and fell down. So this Jewish high priest decided he was going to destroy the temple. But when he decided to do it, he was prevented by God, and basically, as we'll read in the next sentence, he had a stroke. Or,
yeah.
Well, whatever it was, but
yeah.
It says stroke, but...
Yeah, so here, there's a footnote also where it says, which had been there of old time and had been built by the holy prophets. So this wall had been built. They have a footnote. It says, this account of the miserable death of Alcimus or Jacamus, the wicked high priest, the first that was not of the family of the high priests, and made by a vile heathen, Lysias. So
in other words, Lysias was the one that made a heathen, established Alcimus or Jacamus, whatever his name was, as the high priest. Yes. And he wasn't of the lineage of Aaron.
He at least wasn't of the family of the high priests. I don't know, because, the high priest from before that had been from the sons of Zadok for a long time. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So he may still have been of the sons of Aaron. I don't know one way or the other, but he wasn't of the family of the high priests. And, so he was made priest. And so it says here again, this account of the miserable death of Alcimus or Jacamus, the wicked high priest, before the death of Judas, and of Judas's succession to him as high priest, both here and at the conclusion of this book, directly contradicts 1 Maccabees 9, 54 to 57, which places his death after the death of Judas and says not a syllable of the high priesthood of Judas. So let's go back and read that. 1 Maccabees 9, 54 to 57. In the 153rd year, in the 2nd month, Alcimus gave orders to tear down the wall of the inner court of the sanctuary. He tore down the work of the prophets. But he only began to tear it down, for at the time Alcimus was stricken, and his work was hindered. His mouth was stopped, and he was paralyzed, so that he could no longer say a word or give commands concerning his house. And Alcimus died at that time in great agony. When Bacchides saw that Alcimus died, he returned to the king, and the land of Judah had rest for 2 years. Okay, so that doesn't mention anything about Judas, but it mentions about the death of Alcimus. But earlier, so that's in 1 Maccabees 9. Earlier in 1 Maccabees 9, starting at verse 11, it gives the last battle of Judas. And in verse 17 and 18, it says, the battle became desperate, and many on both sides were wounded and fell. Judas also fell, and the rest fled. Then going to verse 19 of 1 Maccabees 9, then Jonathan and Simon took their brother Judas and buried him in the tomb of their ancestors at Modain, and wept for him. So this is clearly before what we find in chapter 9, verses 54 to 57, where Alcimus goes to tear down the wall, and he is stricken. So that is a flat contradiction between the account in 1 Maccabees and the account in Josephus. In 1 Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus dies first.
And there's no mention of a high priesthood.
Yeah, and he never becomes high priest in 1 Maccabees. And Alcimus dies at a later date. And in Josephus, this event with Alcimus trying to tear down the wall takes place, and then he falls while Judas is still alive, and then the people appoint Judas to be the high priest. So that those are two conflicting accounts. So what do you guys think of that?
Either one of them or both of them are wrong, I guess.
Well, that's certainly true, yeah. You know, we know that they both can't be right. One of them or both of them is wrong. So how might we go about determining the truth of the matter?
Go with one inspired.
What's that?
Determine which one is inspired.
Okay, so that's good to ask. And I think there's many aspects to that, so I think let's talk about it. There's a few aspects. So first, let's just answer that question. Does the history given by, or is the history given by Josephus inspired?
Probably not, because he was a historian, right?
Right, he's just a historian.
Good, so he's just a historian, and so he's not claiming inspiration, right? So therefore, to attribute what he's saying as being inspiration isn't necessarily...
wouldn't be fair.
Yeah, it wouldn't be fair. It's not coherent. Okay, so how about 1 Maccabees? Is 1 Maccabees an inspired historical account?
I'm not sure that we've decided that yet.
Yes.
Okay, good. And I think that is, under the circumstances of, not sure if that's been decided, I think that's the perfect and the best thing to say. So that's really good to say, okay, well, how do we how do we deal with that? Okay, so
is there more history that we could compare with to find out what the truth of the matter would be according to more history?
Okay, well, we have 1st Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees, and Josephus. Those are the only 3 accounts that I know of that really discuss these circumstances. But again, if you compare them, what you have is a discrepancy. So how do you deal with that?
We should finish the thought on the inspiration thing.
Yes, we certainly need to finish that. So here's the thing. In terms of 1st Maccabees, what we'd have to do is go through and find out is it inspired. And let me ask you guys, what are some things that we could do to find that out?
Was it ever quoted in other scriptures?
Okay. That's a question that one could ask. But that would certainly have to be of secondary importance for multiple reasons. One is that just quoting something doesn't make it scripture, or doesn't even mean that the person who's quoting it thinks it's scripture. But again, that's dealing with, even if you find something where someone quotes something and they believe it's scripture, that doesn't mean that it's claiming inspiration. So we'd have to address it in a more direct fashion in order to ascertain that with certainty.
Isn't that what we learned about Enoch? Because it was quoted?
Well, that is a little bit different because it was being specifically stated within the context of it being quoted as being scripture. It was quoted as being prophecy.
And not only that, that doesn't actually tell you that it is inspired or that it is scripture. It just tells you that the author of Jude believed it was scripture.
Right.
So if we can verify that the author of Jude was inspired and that Jude is by inspiration and it claims this other thing is inspiration, then you can form that connection. But it's important to recognize the difference between proving one thing and proving another. So, again, in order to know something, we have to look at it on its own merits. And so, 1st Maccabees, on its own merits, is it inspired? How do we determine that?
Well, the first question to ask is, does it claim inspiration?
Perfect, absolutely. Because if it doesn't even claim it, then why would we try to prove it one way or the other? It kind of makes sense that if it doesn't even make the claim, then maybe that's not even the right question to ask. So, I'm sure that not everyone here has read all of 1st Maccabees, but I'm sure that some have. So for those of you who have read it, I'll ask, does 1st Maccabees claim inspiration?
Here's the question on why you're saying all that. I'm sitting there listening going, does history have to be inspired? I mean, I thought truth was truth because it is truth. So if something happened, it happened. And so therefore it is true. Does it need to be, quote, inspiration in order for it to be true?
I'll answer that question directly. The answer is no, and we're certainly getting to that. We're certainly getting to that. That's one of the things in mind, certainly to discuss. So I'm glad that you're mentioning it.
But to answer your question,
I did want to have this question answered first. But
anyone else who has read all of 1st Maccabees might be thinking the same thing I am. I just don't remember one way or the other for certain. I do not recall, however, any claim to inspiration. I just don't recall it. Do you remember? Or what was that, Mary?
Well, I'm cheating, and I'm going to Google, and not that I don't know if these guys are inspired, but it says the Apocrypha, including the 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Baruch, these books do not make any claim to inspiration. That's what just this website that's called justforcatholics.org says. I don't know if that's true or not, but...
Okay. Well, there's a few different aspects to that. There's part of what that said that I would disagree with. It included wisdom in that certain claims to inspiration are made simply by claiming authorship. The Wisdom of Solomon claims, by using certain language, claims to be written by Solomon, who was given the gift of inspiration, wisdom. And so just by claiming to be written by Solomon is a claim to inspiration, even though it's not making very direct claims. Just like Paul, in all of Paul's letters, he doesn't say, know that the words that I speak to you are the commandments of the Lord. Well, he does say that somewhere, but that's only in one letter. But by that, you know that he claims to be an apostle, this and that and that. So the reality of it is that no writings are themselves inspired. Ellen White actually says that plainly. It's not the writing that's inspired. It's not the word that's inspired. It's the authors of those writings who were inspired. And thus their writings are a product of inspiration. That's why I use that phrase a lot. It's to distinguish between the writing itself being inspired and the person being the one inspired, and then the writing is a product of that inspiration. But to my recollection in reading 1st Maccabees, I do not remember anything that is a claim to inspiration, whether by claiming authorship to an inspired person or from an inspired person, or by making other claims to inspiration. Like, for example, the Odes of Solomon. The Odes of Solomon are written anonymously. They do not state authorship anywhere. But within them, it says things like, as the wind blows through the air and moves this and that, so the Spirit moves through my members and creates these hymns and songs or whatever. That is a way of saying, hey, look, what I'm writing here is through inspiration. So that's a claim to inspiration even without making a claim to authorship. So other things claim inspiration just by claiming to be written by Paul or by this person or that person or, some inspired person. So I don't remember anything in 1st Maccabees or in 2nd Maccabees that makes a claim to inspiration. So now going back to what Michael was bringing out, and it's just such a good point, well, does something have to be written by inspiration in order for it to be true or for us to know that it's true? Well, no. History is history. And the vast majority of history that we have isn't necessarily by inspiration. And then another point is that even the writings that we have that are by inspiration, that give history, are not primarily intended to simply communicate history. Even Ellen White's books. You look at the Conflict of Ages series, well, that's a lot of history, but the main point isn't just knowing your history. The main point is to communicate higher truths that we can learn from that history. And so if you look at the development of the book The Great Controversy, for instance, it started, I believe the first edition of it was 1858, Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, The Great Controversy Between Christ and His Angels and Satan and His Angels. And there were some things in there that Ellen White stated incorrectly because of her imperfect knowledge of history. And as she learned more and more of the history, and she actually writes that James White would read to her history books about the history of the Reformers on Sabbath afternoons. They would sit down and he would read these history books to her. And as she learned more and more, and she actually traveled to certain of these places in Europe and so on to get a better understanding of the history. And then she incorporated that clearer understanding of history, and she edited her books in order to correct former mistakes. It wasn't big mistakes. It wasn't theological mistakes. It wasn't an error in the message. It was just simply the history. And some of it may have even been that she learned something from a historian who got it wrong. And so that's all the information she had on the history, so she of course would give it according to the information available. And then later, when better, more accurate history came out and she had those resources, she could go and basically make another edition of her books with a more up-to-date history that would be more accurate. And even today, I'm sure that if we were to go and look through Great Controversy with historical and critical eyes, that we would find historical errors in the Great Controversy. And that's not really a big deal. You know, sometimes people really don't like the thought, but the fact of the matter is that, you know, Ellen White was very, very clear about her dependence on historians for historical points. And hey, if they got it wrong, that's what they got wrong. And you can't expect Ellen White to have gotten it right if all the historians of her day happen to not know a certain thing. So what that shows is that an inspired messenger who writes something which is inclusive of history does not equate to verification of that history being accurate, because most likely they're depending on other sources for that history. And then if we have accounts which don't claim to be inspiration, they are historical accounts of certain events. And so inspiration just doesn't factor into it. So in summary, inspiration doesn't actually make a difference in knowing what actually took place in the past. So to come back to our question, how do we know then what actually happened?
Well, I would say that the Josephus writing we know in the paragraphs above was already corrupted somehow. You can just see that from reading the text plus the footnote. And then the other thing I would say is, I guess that First and Second Maccabees were more contemporary historical account. I mean, they're probably written closer to the time of the events than Josephus' writing was. But then again, I would think because Josephus was a historian, he probably, I would imagine, would have read First and Second Maccabees, unless those weren't available to him. So maybe there was more, Josephus maybe had access to more historical documents than we do. And maybe he had decided that from reviewing those documents that this one was the most historically accurate. I don't know.
Well, that was one of the thoughts that went through my mind, that Josephus may have had more documents available to him than we do today, just like what you just said. And just because First and Second Maccabees date earlier than Josephus' writings doesn't mean that there wasn't something that could have happened to the manuscripts down the way, or even that everything there was written 100% accurately. I mean, I'm of the opinion right now that we may not be able to know for sure which one is accurate.
Yeah, all these things that have been mentioned are very, very good. And what we are engaging in right now is the beginnings of what you might call a historical method, trying to determine what actually happened in the past by asking real questions, looking at the sources, and trying to determine if we can really know by these sources what actually took place. which account is more accurate. So, okay, yeah, we have these points like, hey, look, First Maccabees is a more contemporary historical account, and so the author of First Maccabees would be more privy to that information. In fact, maybe it took place in his own day, and maybe he was an eyewitness. That's a question to ask. Although eyewitness testimony isn't necessarily perfect. Eyewitnesses can lie. Eyewitnesses can also simply remember things wrong, as we all do. But it's still good to have an account. And, if you have an account of something from the days in which it happened versus an account from 200 or 300 years later, well, yeah, that's important. That's good. You mentioned, Mary, about Josephus being a historian. That's certainly the case. However, what it meant to be a historian in the ancient world isn't the same as what it means to be a historian today. They didn't have modern historical methods and, resources and so on. So Josephus was certainly an ancient historian, but the author of First Maccabees, by definition, was a historian as well, because he is giving a history. So those are different aspects to take into consideration. The other thing, as has been mentioned, is that Josephus, while his own account is later than First Maccabees, he may be relying on another account which may be contemporary or even earlier than First Maccabees. So that's really good.
Well, another thing that stands out to me about this particular section, my first thought was, well, Maccabees is probably accurate because we've already seen one other mistake in Josephus. But then I was looking at it more and more, while we've been talking, I've been thinking and reviewing this, and I still think that we may not be able to know for sure. But here we have, the section that directly contradicts First Maccabees is so elaborate. It's not like, a change in a letter or a word. It's a complete, elaborate thought. It goes through how after Alcimus dies, then the people bestow the high priesthood on Judas. Now, maybe just the word Judas is wrong. Maybe it said John or
Jason.
Jason is who I was thinking of. Maybe it said Jason. Well, whoever it was, here's where I'm saying it gets kind of elaborate. The high priest then hears of the power of the Romans. And when he hears the power of the Romans and that they had conquered in war Galatia and Iberia and Carthage and Libya, and besides these, they had subdued Greece and their kings, Perseus and Philip, and Antiochus the Great also, that this high priest resolved to enter into a league of friendship with them, the Romans. So he sends to Rome some of his friends, Eupolemus the son of John and Jason the son of Eleazar. Now there's Jason the son of Eleazar. Is he the same Jason that was made priest in the record of the Maccabees, or is that a different Jason? Different Jason, okay. So he sends his friends, Eupolemus and Jason, and by them desired the Romans that they would assist them and be their friends, and asked the Romans to write to Demetrius that he would not fight against the Jews. So, this is really elaborate, this whole section here. So the Senate received the ambassadors that came from Judas to Rome and discoursed with them about the errand on which they came. And then, so the Romans, they're talking with them and they're getting the message that Jason wants to league with them and that Jason wants Rome to make Demetrius stop fighting against them, and then granted them a league of assistance. They also made a decree concerning it and sent a copy of it into Judea. So the Romans, they made a decree. They sent a copy to Judea. It was also laid up in the Capitol and engraven in brass. So this is, really a big deal. And then it writes what the decree was. The decree of the Senate concerning a league of assistance and friendship with the nation of the Jews. It shall not be lawful for any that are subject to the Romans to make war with the nation of the Jews. So nobody under Roman power could make war against the Jews, nor could they assist anyone else who made war with the Jews, even if they weren't under Roman power. They couldn't even send them food, they couldn't send them ships, and they couldn't send them money. And if any attack was made upon the Jews, the Romans agreed to assist them as far as they were able. And again, if any attack was made upon the Romans, likewise the Jews would come to the aid of the Romans. And if the Jews had a mind to add to or to take away from anything from the League of Assistance, that shall be done with the common consent of the Romans. So they're even giving the Jews leeway. Hey, make any changes as to this that you want, and we'll consent to it. And whatever addition thus shall be made, it shall be of force. It'll be binding. So that was the decree. And it says, this decree was written by Eupolemus, the son of John, and by Jason, the son of Eleazar. So the two friends that Judas sent to Rome as ambassadors. And then there's a footnote, but I'll just finish the sentence. When Judas was high priest of the nation, and Simon, his brother, was general of the army. And this was the first league that the Romans made with the Jews and was managed after this manner. So basically that entire paragraph, if any of it's wrong, all of it's wrong, almost, unless it's just the name Jason, but it's repeated so many times.
Or if it's,
Judas.
Yeah, or if some of these things are misplaced in their history. In other words, it's not necessarily that the whole decree and everything would be totally wrong. It could just be misplaced.
Right. Now, where is it in the history of Maccabees where there's a league made with is it the Romans or is it, what's the other name, Persians?
Are you thinking of the, let's see.
Well, maybe there was both.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was with the Romans, and actually it's right after the death of Nicanor that at least after then it gives the eulogy of the Romans in 1 Maccabees chapter 8, and then starting at verse 17 of 1 Maccabees 8, it gives an alliance with Rome.
Okay.
So there is that alliance with Rome, which is testified to by both resources. So it may be that one is misplaced. But this whole thing, again, it's important for us to recognize, okay, yes, this is a question of history, and thus it must be answered historically. We have to verify what happened one way or the other historically, or if we can't verify, we can't. But all of these different things are worth taking into consideration. We have to see, is 1 Maccabees generally a historically reliable resource? Is Josephus generally a historically reliable resource? And then we have to ask other questions, like people mentioned here about, well, there was obviously an error just before this in Josephus, so could there have been an error here? It's true that that does factor in, but then we also have to consider the errors that may be in 1 Maccabees. In fact, any writing that we have from the ancient world has undergone some form of textual corruption. So we have to see, well, how far does that go for each document? Is one better preserved? Then even if it's well preserved, you have to deal with the historical veracity of it.
Now, would archaeology be able to confirm, or maybe they even have, but I don't know of anything. Archaeological finds could confirm potentially the order of the history.
See, that is a very good thing to mention. If we want to say, okay, how can we verify something? Okay, so maybe archaeology. I mean, imagine this. If an archaeologist was to go to Jerusalem or to Modein, which was basically the home town of the family of the Maccabees, and as we just read, that's where Judas was buried. Let's say they were to dig up Modein and find the tomb of Judas Maccabeus and found
somebody that said he was high priest.
Exactly, something that said he was high priest. Well, hey, you have something going back to the person himself, and that would verify it. So archaeology then is certainly...
That's the most reliable witness.
At least a very, very good witness to be able to verify something. Like if you can pull something up from the ground and you can verify this goes back to the time itself, well then that's huge. That's really important. Now, I want to kind of depart for a moment from this particular issue in Josephus and Maccabees to just show that this is a more widespread issue that we have to deal with. Mark chapter 5 is giving, starting at verse 21, Mark 5:21, is giving the account of the healing of the daughter of Jairus. And I'll read to you part of what it says here. Mark 5:21. When Jesus had passed again in a boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the synagogue rulers, named Jairus, came up, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He asked him urgently, "My daughter is near death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be healed and live." Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. Now, a woman who was there who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years, or a woman was there who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she kept saying, "If only I touch his clothes, I will be healed." At once the bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Jesus knew at once that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around or pressing against you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he looked around to see who had done it. Then the woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue ruler's house, saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" But Jesus, paying no attention to what was said, told the synagogue ruler, "Do not be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue ruler, where he saw noisy confusion and people weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered, he said to them, "Why are you distressed and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they began making fun of him. But he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and his own companions, and went into the room where the child was. Then, gently taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." The girl got up at once and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. They were completely astonished at this. He strictly ordered that no one should know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. Okay, so keep in mind the order of events, how things happened according to what we just read here in Mark. Now let's go to Matthew chapter 9, verse 18, and read the parallel account. As he was saying these things, a ruler came, bowed low before him, and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." Jesus and his disciples got up and followed him. But a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. For she kept saying to herself, "If only I touch his cloak, I will be healed." Now, it goes on and tells the rest of the story and so on. But I want to ask, do you guys see any significant difference there?
Yeah, the girl, in Matthew's account, she was already dead, and in Mark's account, she died on the way. Well, she was on the way.
Right, okay, totally. So, yeah, of course, in Mark's account, she wasn't dead yet. They go and there's, along the way they get stopped by the woman with the hemorrhage. She's healed, and as Christ is talking to her, then people come from Jairus' house and say, "Hey, she's died now.
Don't trouble the guy any longer."
Yeah. But in Matthew's account, he's come and she's already dead. So what is that?
Okay, Ed, you had the answer right last time.
Just a discrepancy. I mean, one of them's right and one of them's wrong, or both of them's wrong.
Right. I mean, is it actually possible? Let's, instead of thinking things according to, my cherished theology and my dogma and what my tradition tells me must be the case. Instead of thinking along those lines, let's just ask the real question. Can it be the case that when Jairus came to Christ, she was both dead and not dead?
No.
No.
No, it's impossible. Those two accounts cannot both be right. She was either dead or she was not dead. That's just the reality of it. So we're referring to an event in the past. The writing that we now call Mark is a history of those events, and the writing that we call Matthew is a history of those events. And there is a detail here which cannot be reconciled. She was either dead or she was not dead, alive. So what type of question is this? What type of problem is this?
It's a problem of historical significance, not of inspiration. One of them, it's a problem of memory. I mean, one of them, when they were writing, remembered the story one way, and the other remembered it another way. Both inspired.
Sure, that's certainly the case. If these are stories told based off memory, which is another question. And then, of course, questions of authorship, claims to inspiration, all those things are other questions. But this question is just simply one of history. Which way did it actually happen? And there may be ways of determining that. And for that, we have to know, well, what's Matthew really about? What is Mark really about? What is their intention in conveying this story? What are the historical sources of one or the other? Does one depend on the other? In the instance with Josephus, it's fairly certain that Josephus had 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees and other books of the Maccabees that we don't even have anymore. And he used them and depended on them, but obviously at some points differed with them, perhaps in favor of another source. So we have to see, is one of these Gospels depending on another? If so, why does it depart from its source? Or are they two independent works dealing with the same source or an oral tradition or both based off memory? Do they claim to be accounts based off memory? We have those sorts of questions to ask, but I think it's important for us to bring these things up to recognize we need to be able to approach things in this light rather than just reading it and thinking, well, I've always grown up with the idea, within the tradition of Christianity, that I can just pick this up and read it and expect it to be basically a transcript of a videotape recording of what actually happened. Well, clearly, not both of these accounts can be that. And maybe neither of them are that. But they both cannot be that. That we know for sure. So I know this kind of moved further on beyond the topic of Nicanor and all that, but I think it's
the perfect time to bring
important.
it up. It's definitely important to recognize that the same type of discrepancy is in the Protestant canon, and what is our reaction to seeing a discrepancy between those books and a discrepancy between, like, Josephus and the Maccabees? Much easier, more automatic for us to just say, oh, well, clearly, either one or both of them is wrong.
Right.
But when it's the Bible, it's like, I can't say that.
Right. We see our tradition and our dogma that we have been trained with coming through, our biases that we have had ingrained into us, myself included.
Oh, for sure.
But so that we all know, that is one example. The one there between Mark and Matthew is one among thousands.
And Hata said it about Ellen White and books in the Bible, about the reckoning or the statement of which day of Passover the wave sheaf was offered.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, hey, the Bible says one thing, Ellen White says another. They can't both be right.
Yeah, I mean, you have to deal with historical things on a historical basis. And here's the thing. To bring things to a little bit more of, okay, we need to view things on terms of reality. Josephus doesn't claim inspiration. I don't think anyone here can mention anything from First Maccabees that claims inspiration. So far as we know at the present time, those are two sources, neither of which claim inspiration, and happen to have a historical discrepancy. So it must be investigated on historical grounds. I don't think anyone here could produce any statement from either Matthew or from Mark that at all indicates that they claimed inspiration, or that at all indicates that they claimed to be first-hand accounts of these events, that either one of them did. So then how must we approach it with these two resources? We have the same circumstance where we have a historical discrepancy. So if we want to know what historically took place, we have to approach it from historical grounds. Now, mind you, I don't think that it is the primary purpose of either Matthew or Mark to tell us exactly the way it happened. Like, it's evidently not the most important point to either of them. They're conveying something else. With Josephus and First Maccabees, again, that's probably not their most important point that they want to make. However, it is significant. Was Judas Maccabeus the high priest, or was he not? All of these points are significant in their own rights. But primarily, one of the things that we have to come to understand when we recognize that we can't just operate within the theology of Scripture canon anymore. We have to start dealing with each thing on their own terms. We have to deal with Josephus on its own terms, First Maccabees on its own terms, Second Maccabees on its own terms, Matthew on its own terms, Mark on its own terms. Go down the list. Just as we need to be critical and ask questions when reading Josephus, when reading First Maccabees, just so we need to be critical and ask questions when reading books within the Protestant canon. There's multiple times where you have accounts given that are different. And how do we view those things? We have to ask questions concerning all these writings, whether in the Protestant canon or not. Does this claim inspiration? If it does claim inspiration, what does it mean? Is this account historically reliable? Is this other account historically reliable? If we have two accounts, how do they match with each other? Sometimes accounts can serve to verify one another. Sometimes they serve to create a complication that we have to sort through. But these are all things to deal with. So, comments, questions?
I think we have to look also at the cultural context. Like, does it make sense that this guy that's involved in battle and warfare, culturally would have been made a high priest?
That's an excellent question as well. Yeah, we have to ask those sorts of things. That is one of the tests of historicity. Historians call it verisimilitude. Does the claim of the history correspond to what is otherwise known about the times and the place and the overall context? In other words, like if we came across an account that claimed to be a history of the life of Jesus, and at one point he pulls a calculator out of his pocket, just to give a very ridiculous example, well, obviously we would know that that does not fit within his time, his place, his context. And so we would know, yeah, that doesn't work. That does not fit. So you have to apply that very broadly and see, okay, well, is this something that is possible within its historical framework? That's certainly one of the things that we should be thinking in testing the veracity of different historical accounts. So, we have been on for over 2 hours now, and we should probably draw it to a close. But if we have other questions or comments, we certainly want people to be able to voice them. So I think I heard Michael.
You had said earlier as well, and I wanted to touch on this, and I had a discussion with somebody, and it had to do with the Bible being, either is the Bible inspired or the men inspired? And I asked somebody, is the scriptures inspired or the Bible inspired? The words of the Bible inspired? And she says, absolutely yes. And I said, so then, whatever you read in the Bible, that's what's inspired. So the words of the Bible inspired. And she says, absolutely. And I asked her the question that says, was the Bible written in English? And she paused and says, well, was the Bible written in English? If the Bible was written in English, okay, then I could see your argument that the words are inspired. But if the Bible was written in Hebrew and translated in English, then Bible is false. Because it's not the word that was it originally written in. You understand what I'm saying? So, that's one of the things that we, really need to realize is that when we're talking about the inspiration, the people that are inspired and not the words that are inspired, because if that was the case, the current Bible we have today in the English translation would not then be inspired because it originally was not written in the English language. Just to keep that as a context of, verifying that it's the prophets that are inspired, not the writings.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's the thought that the author was trying to convey that is the inspired message, rather than the particular words used. And so, yeah, absolutely. That's a hugely important principle.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts or comments? Questions? I know that these ideas can kind of shake people up because it's just so different from how we're used to operating. But I do have to say that when we approach things in their own right, that we do end up on a far firmer foundation.
Amen.
Because think about this. How shaky is our foundation when all it takes to turn over the cart is to just point out a few things that are plainly said in something, you know? So when we recognize, though, that we have been trying to make, by our different traditions and all of this, we have been trying to make the individual books that were compiled into the Bible to be something that they never were intended to be and never claimed to be, then maybe we can take a little breath of fresh air and say, hey, okay, if I judge it off its own merits and view it on its own merits without trying to make it something that it's not, then I don't have to necessarily put myself through that struggle. Because that is the struggle that people go through, of trying to make it something it's not and trying to make it something it doesn't claim to be. And then when something challenges what they think it's supposed to be, then it becomes a real trial. But we need to just operate according to reality. So anyways, if there are not any other questions or comments, would someone like to volunteer to close off with prayer?
I will.
Sure, thanks.
Heavenly Family, I thank you for this time of study and this time of prayer. I thank you so much for giving all of us, Trent and Teresa, to really guide our minds and direct our thoughts and direct our thought processes and our understanding of canon and the hidden books. The Sister White said the wise in the last days would understand or search to understand. And obviously you're getting ready to reveal something huge to us, I would imagine. That's why you're preparing our hearts to really investigate so that we will not be shaken and so that we can be on a firm foundation to know the truth to set us free. So I praise you and I worship you. I thank you again for this wonderful time. I pray for each person on the phone, all the branch candidates, those that are with us on the call and those that are not. And I pray that you be with us, of course, all the time, but especially tomorrow on the call as well, to open our minds and hearts to receive your truth. In the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
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 Thank you, Heavenly Family.
Todah Eloheinu. Thank you so much, our God.